My friends, do you realize the Russian army is about to inflict a major operational defeat on Ukraine? And it's not me saying it, it's The Economist. Ukraine is on the brink, says senior general. No, wait! Please don't fire me, here's what he really said. A fresh Russian push will test Ukraine severely, says a senior general. That's right, the wild Russian cavalry charge in eastern Ukraine continues. Today I'm warning you it's gonna be a girthy one. We're going to look at the overall situation and analyze every hotspot on the front line one by one. As a little foreplay, here are all the villages that recently transitioned and that now self-identify as Russian. Ocheretine, Novobakhmutivka, Solovyove, Bierdyshi, Semenivka, Novokalinove, Keramik, Arkhangelske, Kislivka, and Robotine.
We are winning!
As you can see, it's a complete debacle for Ukraine. The Russian army is rolling right through. We witnessed fleeing Ukrainian combat units, abandoned to their own fate, entire squads surrendering to Russian forces, and scores of Ukrainian armored vehicles simply left behind to be picked up by the Russians, like this M1A1 Abrams tank.
Hurrah!
Since mid-April, after the initial breakthrough towards Ocheretine, Russian commanders of the 41st Combined Arms Army are piling in all the reserves into that breach. Because of that, the Russian bulge brutally expanded, now 10 kilometers deep inside enemy lines. In 3 weeks, they did better than Ukraine with its NATO-trained brigades during the entire summer counteroffensive. And now the danger is that forward elements of the Russian army are only 10 kilometers away from a very strategic crossroad right along the TO504 road linking Pokrovsk to Konstantinivka. If the Russians get there, the Ukrainians might as well say Bomboklat. Welcome to History Legends, and here are the latest news of the Russo-Ukrainian war. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. As you know, some of my Ukrainian videos have been targeted with limited or no ads. So make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal to keep the show running. Thank you to everyone that has already helped, and welcome to the headquarters. For the frontline analysis, let's start with the most important battle right now, the Russian breakthrough in Ocheretine. In my last video, I told you the Russian command had 3 options available. Option 1 for Russia would be to focus on the capture of Solovyove and turning Ukrainian positions along the Berdyshy-Semenivka-Umanske line. If successful, this could lead to a chain reaction and cause the Ukrainians to retreat all the way up to Novopokrovsk. Number 2, after clearing Ocheretine, the Russians could push towards Arkhangelsk in an attempt to encircle Ukrainian positions in Novokalinove and Keramik, all the while pinning down and providing direct support for their flanking operation on the eastern side. Option 3 would be riskier, in an attempt to really break through Ukrainian lines and force a major withdrawal, evacuation. The Russian army could continue their wild cavalry charge towards Solovyove, Sokil, and or Novo-Alexandrivka. Which one did they pick? This is what we'll discover together. By the 25th of April, Russian riflemen had reached the outskirts of the brick factory on the western side of the village of Ocheretine. Heavy fighting took place there. Here's the perspective of an incoming Ukrainian armored vehicle, overlooking intense Russian artillery shelling on that factory. While the Battle of Ocheretine was coming to an end, the Russians managed to get a foothold in the hamlet of Solovyove. The place is literally one street in a square. In this video from the 25th, Russian infantry units are clearing a residential area of Solovyove while others are taking position in abandoned trenches all around the settlement. Just like in the previous days, the Ukrainians had no shock units to counterattack. All they could do was to inflict as many casualties on the enemy using their firepower. For example, here Ukrainian artillery covered the settlement of Solovyove with cluster munitions. Swarms of drones also harassed Russian soldiers like these ones that were trying to hide in a Soviet-era bus stop. Thing is, this event was geolocated at the western end of Solovyove. Meanwhile, another wave of Ukrainian drone strikes took place on the southwestern end of the settlement, meaning that within a day, Russian riflemen had already covered the entire place. For Ukraine, the loss of Solovyove meant that it would be impossible to fall back to the Novopokrovsky line since the positions were already about to be turned. This is why the 47th Mechanized Brigade was urgently redeployed right in that sector. Now with Solovyove under control of the Russian armed forces, an operation to break the Berdysha-Semenivka line could be undertaken, both through a frontal attack and a flanking maneuver from the north. That's how Russian infantrymen were already spotted in various foxholes in this sector between Novobakhmutivka and Berdyshy. In this video you can see a bird's eye view of the village of Semenivka. You can see the small ponds that the Russians had to cross using these little crossing points. But overall, it's a tiny settlement. The Ukrainian army held the line for a month and a half, but eventually the Russian troops successfully stormed these settlements. Because of Russian firepower, the Ukrainians cannot send entire relief columns. They can only dispatch one vehicle at a time, and this makes reinforcing hotspots extremely difficult. 2 Ukrainian vehicles were geolocated 1,200 meters west of the village, an MTLB and one MaxPro MRAP, both destroyed on their way to Semenivka. They were probably carrying much needed reinforcements. By the 26th of April, a Russian infantry unit raised the red banner on the village of Semenivka. The next day, on the 27th, Russian stormtroopers raised their unit's battle flag on the last building of Berdyshy. There must have been a lot of back and forth, but by May 1st, it was a done deal.
Населенный пункт Бердычи наш. Слава первому батальону, черным гусарам, воинам-александрийцам. Слава России! Победа за нами! Победа будет за нами!
Fun fact, the 5th Regiment of Hussars was formed in 1783. Their mission was to guard the Dnieper defensive lines, so their barracks were located in Alexandria, now part of Kirovograd Oblast in Ukraine. This is when the situation turned catastrophic north of Ocheretine, as the Russians were flanking Novokalinove from the east. The Ukrainian command immediately dispatched some reinforcements, like these 2 fire teams that arrived in this vehicle, which then brought wounded soldiers back to the rear. But soon enough, the first Russian infantry squads reached the northern tip of Novokalinove. Some of them entered this massive compound, which was then targeted by a Ukrainian tank. The Ukrainian troops in Keramik and Novokalinove were 2 steps from hell. These soldiers had a heart of courage as they were overwhelmed, but still repelled one enemy assault after another. To glory, only a decisive Ukrainian counterattack to regain Ocheretine would save them from encirclement. The problem is that the 47th Mechanized Brigade was clearly rushed into battle. They were already in contact with the enemy and must have suffered heavy casualties. Here's a first abandoned M2A2 Briedli. Here's another one. In this video you can see an abandoned M1A1 Abrams tank. Fuck. What a disaster. What a disaster. All this because of a botched relief in place. Here you can see what the western sector of Ocheretine looks like, with dozens of 5-floor apartment blocks, meaning they had been built during the Khrushchev era in the 1960s. And now you can have a good look at the brick factory, where heavy fighting took place for around a week. Despite Ukraine's best efforts to hold this position, Russian assault squads swarmed the place and started clearing the entire industrial area floor by floor. By the 28th of April, assault detachments of the Russian armed forces advanced into the residential sector northeast of Ocheretine and captured another set of multi-level buildings that were then shelled by Ukraine. But the Russian command was pouring in all available reinforcements and reserves into that gap. After securing the brick factory, Russian troops pushed another 1.5 kilometers west along the railway line, and this attack was now going at full speed towards Novo-Alexandrivka on a 2-kilometer front. That same day, the Russians had split into the Ukrainian defenders of Keramik and Novokalinove. This is when Ukrainian forces started abandoning these 2 villages. Perhaps individual units had already started withdrawing on their own, trying to jump on any armored vehicle that could bring them to the rear. And now, this caused a beautiful cauldron around Arkhangelsk. I swear, 24 hours later, I was shocked to learn that formed elements of the Russian army had already been detected right at the center of Arkhangelsk after a 2-kilometer push. All this is happening because the Ukrainians had not prepared any defensive positions, meaning there was no defense in depth possible. Once the Russians break through, it's GG well played. Since the wild cavalry charge continued west of Ocheretine, straight towards Novoalexandrivka, it was just a matter of time before Ukrainian troops abandoned Arkhangelsk as well.
A unit is running from the battlefield! A shameful display!
For example, another Russian motorized rifle unit was heading towards the settlement of Sokil. The Ukrainian 47th Mechanized Brigade was deployed along this sector to protect the flank of all the Ukrainian troops in that area that were really at risk of being cut off. However, that also meant that the 47th Mechanized Brigade could not counterattack in the north towards Arkhangelsk. More and more Russian riflemen were brought to the front aboard armored vehicles like this 10-man squad. The soldier at the front spotted the Ukrainian drone overlooking them, and everyone quickly jumped off. There was reason to panic because an M2 Bradley of the 2nd Battalion 47th Mechanized Brigade showed up and destroyed this MTLB armored troop transport. The 47th Mechanized also annihilated the Russian armored column of around 6 vehicles pushing south of Solovyove on the road to Novopokrovsk. So in the end, what battle plan did the Russian command pick? Well, they applied the tequila principle. Instead of one shot, they took all 3 on the table and combined options 1, 2, and 3 that I showed you last week, aka the worst case scenario for Ukraine.
All hope is failing, my lord! The battle is almost done!
And what is Ukraine doing to solve the problem? They're destroying World War II Soviet war memorials, and of course they're packing more meat into the vans.
More!
Now let's talk about the situation south of Avdiivka. While the flowers of Ocheretine were blooming in spring, Russia opened up Ukrainian lines with a deep thrust that left them shaking. After the capture of Pervomaivske, now the eye of Sauron was turned on Netailove. And it seems the Russian command is already preparing for a river crossing operation of the Vovcha River. There are 4 clues that brought me to this conclusion that happened between the 26th and the 28th of April. First of all, these Russian FPV drones were roaming around Kalinove and harassed enemy troops in that sector. In that same area, Russian artillery also struck an enemy mortar position. Here, an FPV drone hit and damaged this Ukrainian Mada infantry fighting vehicle, which was then finished off by a grenade-dropping drone. And lastly, in this one, the Russians destroyed a building that they believed was hiding a number of Ukrainian soldiers. Only after this preparation was completed, with reserves pinned down and strongholds destroyed, that the main assault was launched against Netailove. Again, we're very far from the myth of the human waves. Russian assault detachments ended up advancing 1.2 kilometers westwards, Zapad, Z, and gained a foothold inside the first houses of the settlement. This farm here could be turned into a solid defensive outpost to deter further Russian attacks, if and only if the Ukrainians managed to hold on to the rest of the village. Now let's turn to the Battle of Krasnoorivka, located 20 kilometers southwest of Avdiivka. In my previous video on the Battle of Krasnoorivka, I said the following. So assault squads of the 5th Brigade will have no other choice but to carry on attacks from the south, essentially frontal attacks. But they can also try to expand their area of control from the east. Essentially, the Russian army attacked head-on. How, you might ask? That's right, turtle tanks. Here's one of them leading IFVs under heavy enemy fire. Eventually, the IFVs landed their infantry component right inside the industrial zone. We can believe that this continuous stream of reinforcements provided the Russians with enough of a numerical advantage to be able to storm the industrial sector. Here's a video from the 25th of April where we see the massive Krasnoorivka refractory industrial zone, 300 meters wide by 1,200 meters long. This stronghold stopped the Russians for 10 days. But if we zoom in, we see that the position had already fallen into enemy hands. The Krasnoorivka factory should have never been lost that easily, but this simply means Ukraine did not have enough manpower in the city to fully defend it. Then, on the 27th of April, Ukrainian drone operators released this video of multiple strikes against Russian units. Thing is, those were geolocated in the sector, meaning the Ukrainians were losing control of the eastern part of Krasnohorivka. Meanwhile, detachments of the 5th Brigade Oplot of the DPR were also trying to turn Ukrainian positions from the western end of the city. This means Ukrainian troops could only exit this cauldron through one very vulnerable road. And surprise, surprise, 2 days later, some Russian troops advanced 500 meters and captured this stronghold you can see on the map. In this Ukrainian drone footage, you can also see the position nicknamed the Hunting House, some sort of tower, and a set of trenches built in 2015 that were now all under Russian control. We can see that the combination of all these attacks was to force the Ukrainians to abandon Krasnohorivka. Now, according to Ukrainian reports, reinforcements arrived and managed to knock the Russians out of the city of Krasnohorivka. As of now, I press X for doubt, but we never know. Now let's go north. Things are also getting hot for Ukraine in Chasiv Yar, where the 98th Guards Air Assault Division was continuing its offensive against the city. Overall, the situation in that part of the front is so critical that many battalions were urgently transferred from Kupiansk down to Chasiv Yar, like 5 out of 6 battalions of the elite Kraken Regiment, roughly 2,000 soldiers. Here's some HD drone footage of the Canal micro-district, the urban area located on the eastern outskirts of Chasiv Yar. As usual with the vodka principle, the Russians proceeded with their regular bombardment of enemy positions. Now, since most Ukrainian troops are located in basements, it's unsure how lethal these strikes actually are. However, these artillery strikes do pin down the defenders and prevent any sort of resupply and reinforcement from coming in. That's how on May 2nd, forward elements of the Russian paratrooper division managed to consolidate a foothold in the outskirts of the micro-district. They also managed to clear this forest and reach the crossing over the Siversky Donets Canal. As always, we can keep track of Russian progress through drone footage from the Ukrainian side. For example, according to the latest news, some Russian recon units were struck while roaming in that sector. It's possible the Ukrainians also tried to launch a counterattack supported by armored vehicles. However, we have to assume the counterattack failed. The Russians are still in position, and a T-64 BV tank was destroyed 500 meters from the canal crossing. From an operational perspective, Ukraine has lost the initiative. The latest breakthrough opened up a lot of possibilities for the Russian command. In my opinion, the logical objective could be Kostiantynivka, with a pincer maneuver with an attack from the east. Thus, the importance of the Battle of Chasiv Yar, since it's the last major urban area before Kostiantynivka. This would be coupled with an attack from the south. The Russian troops in Ocheretine could push north and cut the Hl-504 road linking Pokrovsk with Kostiantynivka, possibly at this crossroad right here, 10 kilometers away from their current positions. Then they could conquer the area between the H20 highway and the Hl-504 road. This would allow the Russian army to encircle Kostiantynivka and force its defenders between an early pullout or last stand. Since we talked about Kupiansk, I think it's also important to talk about the situation on the Luhansk front. Like I said in my previous video, the Ukrainian forces along the Luhansk front are actually holding their combat positions pretty well. Now remember how in late January 2024, Russian army units managed to push 4 kilometers up until the village of Tabaivka. I say village, it's literally 3 houses. Thing is, back then their offensive came to a stop, namely due to Ukrainian strongholds in and out of the village of Kislivka and Kotlyarivka. By the way, here's what the village of Kislivka looks like from above. There's the railway line on the right side of the screen and just a couple of big buildings. All the rest are individual homes. Russian aviation then dropped their heavy loads, obliterating Ukrainian strongholds in and around Kislivka. On the 21st of April, there was a Russian artillery strike on the command and control center of Ukrainian drone operators in the sector. Like we said many times, the ability of Russian aviation to drop their FAB bombs at will has really been a game changer in the latest campaign. That's how on the 26th of April, Russian troops got a foothold inside Kislivka. They probably spotted a weakness in enemy defenses and then poured in available reserves right
Into the breach!
and secured the eastern half of the village 4 days later by the 30th of April. And that's how a tiny Russian flag was raised at the center of the settlement.
Давай.
Мы, 47-я танковая дивизия, 272-й полк, рота В «Витязя» под командованием подполковника Кирова, и командира роты Лезгина. Взяли поселок Кислов. Служим Российской Федерации. С нами Бог. Аминь.
According to the latest news, there's still some fighting taking place on the western end of Kislivka. There was footage of Russian assault squads being shelled in that area by Ukrainian artillery. Now the problem is that the Ukrainian troops in the village of Kotlярivka are now in a cauldron, and once again they cannot let the two tips touch. So we're witnessing a retrograde movement and some sort of fighting retreat out of Kotlярivka. Now this is problematic because a lot of Ukrainian reserves from Kupiansk were transferred to Chasiv Yar. Let's see what happens. I'm looking at the map and this could very well open the road to Kupiansk for the Russian army. In the south of the Luhansk front, Russian troops are trying to push through these tree lines to get to the villages of Terny and Yampolivka. However, small groups of determined Ukrainian riflemen stubbornly defend their combat positions. The front has not changed much in the last weeks, and it's actually the Ukrainians that managed to counterattack and push the line 1,250 meters forward. There was also this Ukrainian ATACMS missile strike on May 1st against a Russian training ground somewhere on the Luhansk front, with over 100 Russian soldiers reported as KIA. This must have been a well-prepared operation. They knew the exact location of the Russian firing range, and above all, there was a Ukrainian drone that recorded everything that happened, meaning that Russian electronic warfare assets in that sector had been jammed or destroyed. So this event was pure negligence by the Russian command, and it's not the first time that this happens. Now we move to the Zaporozhye front line with the village of Robotine. Another hotspot for Ukraine is the village of Robotine that they painfully captured during the 2023 summer counteroffensive. I say village, but it's really a euphemism, because as you can see in these images, there is nothing left but ruins. Ukrainian soldiers can only hide in basements underneath all the rubble. Once again, due to the difficult situation at the front, a number of reserves from the Robotine sector were urgently redeployed towards Ocheretine. This allowed the local Russian commander to make some moves. After heavy shelling by Russian fighter bombers and attack helicopters, where's our defense? On the 29th of April, stormtroopers of the 2nd Battalion, 71st Regiment broke through enemy lines, advanced 500 meters and raised the white-blue-red flag in the northern part of Robotine. By May 1st, Robotine was still not fully secured by the Russian army. As always, there was a lot of back and forth. At the same time, the 108th Guards Cuban Cossack Air Assault Regiment of the 7th Air Assault Division was clearing trench networks around the settlement, which, as you can see in this video, are covered in destroyed vehicles from both sides. Depending on the momentum, perhaps Ukraine will be forced to fall back to a new line of defense. It's really tragic because Ukrainian soldiers fought so hard to get there, and all their gains are slowly being rolled back by the enemy. As for Urozhaine on the eastern part of the Surovikin defensive line, Russian forces also launched a series of attacks to regain control of the town. In this drone footage, you can see what the settlement looks like from above. Mostly spread out dachas and flat, open terrain. The Russians attempted to storm Urozhaine with a quick mechanized assault. According to this video, Ukraine unleashed a storm of steel on advancing vehicles, and Ukraine BMPs fired at them from hidden positions that I believe to be somewhere in that sector, in these tree lines. Once again, there's no actual infantry to counterattack. That's how on the 25th of April, one of the Russian motorized units advanced 300 meters and secured the southern outskirts of Urozhaine. Pro-Ukrainian Deep State UA only conceded the loss on May 1st. With that being said, on this part of the front, the Russian army seems to be in no rush to reconquer the lost ground, and are only attacking if the opportunity arises. Now the last major area of fighting is around Novomikhailivka. To ensure the success of the next operation, in late April, the Russian army started eliminating enemy fighting positions, one by one. Like this German-made Mada IFV, this SPG-9 recoilless anti-tank weapon, or even this mortar pit. Russian Marines were also spotted 400 meters from the first houses of Paraskovivka, where they were harassed by Ukrainian drones. So we already talked about how the Russians captured the settlement of Novomikhailivka. As you know, over the past year, all Russian attacks against Vuhledar have failed. So Russian artillery simply pummels any large building in the town, on top of drones harassing Ukrainian military personnel. The objective could be to pin down Ukrainian forces in Vuhledar and flank them from the east. to roll back Ukrainian positions all the way up to the O0532 road, linking Vuhledar to Kostiantynivka. No, not the same Kostiantynivka as in the north. Yes, all the towns in Ukraine have the same names, it's another Kostiantynivka. And this would open new possibilities for the encirclement of Vuhledar by the Russian army. That's all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to support my work, make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal. The links are in the description below.